Good evening, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and during these half-hour programs, I'll be interviewing writers about their careers, their ambitions, their craft of writing. Those careers might be in journalism, they might be in fiction, they might be in poetry. We plan to cast a very wide net. We'll be sharing information with you, of course, but we hope to have a good time doing it. The show will be varied, and it will be open to your ideas and comments. If you have suggestions for the Writer's Block, or if you'd like to be on the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. Tonight's guest is Joe Garland, a writer of wide and varied experience. As a journalist, he worked in the past for the Associated Press, the Providence Journal, the Boston Herald, and other publications. He's also been a very busy freelance writer. He's written articles and books that deal with New England, the North Shore above Boston, and more specifically, Cape Ann. Down to the Sea, The Fishing Schooners of Gloucester was published by David Godine in 1983. The Gloucester Guide, A Stroll Through Place and Time, was published in 1990 this year by Rockport's Protean Press. Those are just a couple of his many publications that give you an idea, I think, of where he's concentrated much of his energy. Let's go over and meet Joe now. Good evening. How are you? Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
I mentioned in the intro that you had been originally a journalist, and we spoke briefly about that before we went on. You worked for, I think, out of college, the Boston Herald. Was that directly out of?
No, it was a circuitous. It was a kind of a circuitous thing. I was pre-medical in college. I was headed for medicine in the old family tradition, and then I flunked organic chemistry so badly in 1942, which was right in the middle of the war. I didn't get into any medical school. I went from there into the army and into the infantry in Europe. And when I came back, I finished up college, decided then to switch, go into journalism and newspaper work. So my first job was in 1940. Late 46, I guess, with the Minneapolis Tribune.
So you graduated as a journalism major? Or
no,
English major?
I ended up as an English major, yeah. In fact, I was majoring in English and doing pre-med simultaneously. Maybe that was part of the problem.
The English won.
The English won.
So you began in Minneapolis.
I started my work. My first newspaper job was in Minneapolis, yeah. I guess it was 46, 47. I was there for about a year, came back east and got a job with the Associated Press in Boston. Was with the AP for a year or so, and doing business writing and one thing and another. Went down to the Providence Journal as a night financial editor for several months. There's a story connected with that, but we won't bother. Then back to the AP, and then from the AP to the Herald.
I can't talk you into that story.
Well,
if it's not a scandalous story.
No, it's not a scandalous story. I was living in Natick at the time. I was married and living in Natick, which is west of Boston. And I took this job in Providence a little bit tentatively because I think the hours were 6 to 2 in the morning. So I started commuting. I was coming back from Providence one morning at about 2:30 when I got through. I was going through Pawtucket. I was going about 35 miles an hour through a 25-mile zone, and a cop stopped me. And wanted to know what I was doing. I said, I work for the Providence Journal. I'm on my way home. Now you got to understand the Providence Journal was always going after corruption in Pawtucket. So I got a ticket, and I had to show up in court the next Saturday, I think. Drove all the way down to Pawtucket, appeared in court with a few drunks and various other poor unfortunates. And the judge took one look at me, wanted to know what my background was. I said, I'm with the Providence Journal. He leaned back in his bench, and he said, well, I think it was a moderate fine, but whatever it was, say a $25 fine, and your license to drive a motor vehicle in Rhode Island suspended indefinitely.
So you figured at the end of you as a source for information.
I tried the bus going in from Natick to Boston, and then taking the train for about a week, and it just didn't pan. You couldn't do it. It was impossible to do it. So I resigned from the Journal after about 4 or 5 months there, and they took me back at the AP.
So that sounds pretty out-and-out political way of squelching the Providence Journal.
The Providence Journal they were always going after Pawtucket. They hit Pawtucket a lot harder than they did Providence.
I want to keep on the journalism background because I've done some journalism and we had spoken about it earlier. You went from the AP to the Herald. Do I have that right yet?
From the AP, yes, I went from the AP to the Herald. And while I was with the Herald, I had a couple of leaves of absence working as an organizer and sort of general pork chopper for the Old American Newspaper Guild. And I got involved in running 2 or 3 organizing campaigns and running a strike, and all very unfamiliar territory to me. And finally ended up back again at the Herald. I was doing labor, I'd been doing labor reporting, and I'd been doing some medical news. Someone suggested that maybe I ought to combine the two and cover obstetrics.
Take them up on that.
But in any case, I had been doing a lot of medical news because of my own medical background. And when I did finally leave newspaper work for freelancing, not really for freelancing, I went with the old Massachusetts Memorial Hospitals in Boston as director of public relations. Hated it. I was with them for, hate PR, still do. You'll notice, incidentally, that in the list of exempted occupations from the new sales tax that's going through on services, prominently I noticed in the list that is public relations. How do you suppose that happened? Think of all the lobbyists up on the Hill.
They must be good at what they do, I guess, huh? You were switching, even when you were in school, you switched from pre-med, and your wonderful experience with organic chemistry, to journalism or English, and then you were involved in public relations, you were involved in union work. Were you still deciding what you wanted to do? Not really. Forever, or were you a journalist?
I really considered myself, I think, basically a journalist, and that was my training. It was on-the-job training. I had my background in English was in English Lit at Harvard, and I'd always enjoyed writing. Way back when I was in prep school. My father was a doctor, but was also a writer, and a very fine one. So it was a good fallback for me. And so when I didn't make medicine, it seemed natural. And when I came out of the war, I was in Europe, and when I came out of the war, I kept a journal during my period in combat in Europe, and I had strong feelings about newspaper work, to see what could be done to make the world a better place, sort of following up a bit on what we'd done as soldiers in the war, to see what you could do as a journalist. I felt it was a sort of a frontline kind of profession. We're trying to pick up and follow through on the things that that whole war had been about. So it had a certain logical progression as far as I was concerned.
Did you send pieces back for publication?
No. I kept a journal.
You weren't writing for a local newspaper, sending any information back?
I was. I didn't have the time. I was an infantry soldier up in Europe, so we didn't have much. But I did keep this journal, and we leapfrog, and that's the book I'm currently trying to work on now.
So you've come back 40 years or so?
Yeah.
40 years? When do you expect to finish that?
Good question. I started it in 77, I think, was when I first got the idea, and began researching it in 78, and I've kept putting it aside. I think I've written about 5 books since I started it. I keep putting it aside. Somebody comes along with a commission for a book, whatever, so I want to get a little bit ahead, so I put it aside, put out another book. But I'm back to it. I got it half written about 4 years ago and not satisfied, so I'm back starting all over again.
Do you have a tentative title?
Tentative title...
we can look for it 2 or 3 years down the road.
Well, let's see. Who knows what it'll end up. But the tentative title that I've been working with is Unknown Soldiers.
And you were in Europe?
I was in Europe.
France?
In Italy.
Italy?
With the 45th Division, 45th Infantry Division.
You came up with the invasion then?
I went in 43.
Late 43, October 43?
You're right on the button. Your history's good.
Was it?
I went in as a replacement. Spare parts. And landed in Naples right after, about a day or two after. We were the first troop ship in Naples. In fact, we were, so far as I know, we were on a British liner from a troop ship, converted liner from Bizerti. And we landed in early October of 43. As soon as Naples was cleared, the Germans had done a terrible job, tremendous. They just had bombed, sabotaged the whole harbor. As far as I know, we were the first troop ship on the continent of Europe. And we went in through Naples, we went through and we bivouacked in a racetrack that Mussolini had built just north of Naples, set up our pup tents, and we formed a replacement depot. It was the first American replacement depot in Europe. We camped out there in pup tents.
This is 9 months before D-Day and Normandy, long before that.
This is just at the beginning of the Italian campaign, right after the Salerno landing.
I think that's interesting that your latest project, or latest continuing project, goes back to experiences that you had when you were in your late teens, early 20s. One of the last questions I ask is, what are you working on now? What's your next project? So that question's out of the way, but I want to follow it up with this. Do you draw always for your present books, your present freelance writing, on your own area, your own experience? Or do you decide, I want to do an article about cactuses in Arizona?
Good question. My freelancing has really been, I wouldn't say it was market-oriented, but since I've been living in Gloucester in the last 30 years, it's been basically Gloucester. It's been regional, and I've drawn to some degree on personal experience, but very little. I've put most of my personal experience in the columns I've done for the Gloucester Times. I think I've done about 350 columns all told for the Times. I've drawn fairly heavily on personal experience for those columns. But the freelance work has been nonfiction, historical, biographical. You always draw a lot. You draw a good deal on your own experience, obviously. I think you draw on your own experience in relating the experience of others. You bring such insights as you've gathered from your own experience over the years, the older you get, into your portrayal and your attempt to understand and communicate something about others and what moves them and has moved them and so forth. But this book that I'm working on now, this book about my war experience, is really frogging way back to I suppose you'd say, the central experience of my life, which came with so many of us right at virtually the beginning. And I think every writer who has been through that kind of experience has to write about it. My sense has been, I've got to write about that, because it's really so much at the center. It's not so much, I think, that I'm not so much concerned about lack of resolution. You know, William Manchester in Goodbye Darkness clearly had been haunted by so much of his own experience in Asia, in combat, and there were ghosts that he really had to lay, and he wrote a magnificent book in the process of doing it. And I'm sure I've got ghosts to lay, but that's not really been my basic central motivation in this. I'm interested in exploring my own experience to see if there are some ghosts there that maybe I'm not aware of. To write about it because it's really it's central to me. But I'm writing not just about my own experience, but about the members of my platoon. So this is sort of a mass biography of the survivors of my platoon. We were all very close, a remarkably diverse bunch of people. I went back and I found about 18 or 20 of them all around the country. And after 35 years, I had a tape recorder and a camera, spent a day or so with each of them. I've got 80 or 90 hours or so of tapes, but it's also presented me with some of the technical problems of trying to work this book out. But what I've been trying to do is to explore my own experience, but also to explore the experience of these other guys, and our mutual retrospect, our mutual look back on that experience of almost 50 years ago now.
Yeah, 47 years.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, you mentioned biography in connection with what's presently titled Unknown Soldiers. And a couple of the titles that I read about your work in Cape Ann, such as Down to the Sea, The Fishing Schooners of Gloucester. Are you still a journalist specializing in the history of the war in which you were involved, or Gloucester, or are you an historian? Or is there a difference?
Yeah, I think that there is some difference. I think my basic view is probably still journalistic. And I think my tendency is to take a sort of a journalistic view of the past or of history. Yeah, I would say that probably at the core my view tends to be journalistic. History, yeah, I'm sometimes referred to as a historian, but I don't consider myself a historian. I see myself as a writer, as a journalist, who's observing either the current scene or the scene in the past. But what I try to do is, I'm really concerned with perspective and with flow. A good friend and neighbor of mine down in Eastern Point many years ago was Catherine Drinker Bowen, the biographer.
Historian.
And historian, but basically biographer. She had no formal training in history. And she wrote some magnificent history. But she was always rather plaintive about the fact that whenever she would go to conventions or meetings, she was always sniffed at by the formal historians. The academic historians did not accept her. They didn't consider her to be totally bona fide. They saw her as a bit of an outrider.
Did she write a biography of Cook, Lord Chamberlain under Elizabeth?
Right.
Is that Bowen? Catherine Drinker Bowen?
That was nearly one of her last books. And she did John Adams, of course.
John Adams, yes.
And Oliver Wendell Holmes. But there's a difference. And I suppose in a sense...
difference between historian and journalist?
Well, I think so. But then you merge. You talk about somebody like Samuel Eliot Morison. And in Morison, you have someone who superbly, in my opinion, absolutely superbly combines the historian and the journalist, because for instance, his account of Columbus's voyage. We got 92 coming up. Whatever, I forget one of his great books, but he applied all of his credentials as an academic historian to that, and then he went in a yacht and recreated and sailed the voyage himself.
So both
went over the whole track.
Both sides of the coin.
And with his great history of the multi-volume history of the U.S. Navy, he was, of course, the official U.S. Naval historian during World War II.
14 volumes, I think.
Sorry, an incredible job, absolutely incredible, massive job.
Work, yeah.
But you get into that, and you'll see it's gripping. He has the perspective of a great historian who really knows his stuff, but he has that immediacy and the robustness or the robustiousness of the contemporary man.
Let me ask you, who else? You mentioned Morrison, you mentioned Catherine Drinker Bowen. Who else do you read now?
I've read right now.
Who else would you recommend reading, either in history or outside of history?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I certainly would read. Of course, I'm a great admirer of Kitty Bowen. She was a wonderful writer, tremendous vitality. Morrison, you've sort of got me. I'd have to think about that.
Well, I stole the answer.
Part of my problem is one of my problems is I'm ashamed to say I do very little reading, accepting as it seems to accepting in researching what I'm working on.
That would be a good point for me to segue into something that you've very recently worked on, and I believe both as an author and as a director. I am referring to the Gloucester Adventure Incorporated, for which you have been and are president and director.
Well, I was. I'm still associated, but I'm neither president nor director any longer.
Oh, all right. Beginning in '88, for 2 years you were both.
Yeah.
And you have written Gloucester's Adventure.
I wrote Adventure, the book about the schooner.
Yeah, the book and several freelance articles and the book.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that schooner and why you started doing it. I guess I should ask, what is it, first of all, because many of our audience might not know. It's a ship in Gloucester being restored.
Right, 125, 126-foot fishing schooner. The last of the, we don't need to go into the technique of dory trawling, but she was the last of the vessels that fished in the old-fashioned way under sail out of Gloucester. And in fact, she was the last one in America. And she was, when she gave up her career fishing, she went down to Maine, where she took cruises, weekly cruises out of Camden for about 30 years. And in '87, I think it was, she was donated by Captain Jim Sharp to Gloucester. She badly needed repairs. And we formed this non-profit corporation called the Gloucester Adventure to own her and to operate her and to create a kind of an educational program around her and to begin the process of raising the money to restore her. The way the book got started was that I had been asked by Harold Bell, who's the president of the Cape Ann Historical Association, if I could do if I might be able to do a book, a sort of an evocative, poetic kind of a book based on the photographs in the Gordon Thomas collection. Gordon Thomas was a Gloucester historian, and his great collection of photographs had been presented to the Historical Association, mainly of harbor scenes and of schooners. And Hal wanted a book that evoked the poetry, the poetic sense of these schooners. And I knew Gordon well, and I knew his collection well, but the one thing that his collection lacked was vessels in motion and at sea. So as I sometimes do, I kind of got the bit in my teeth on this thing, and I began to look into the subject a little further and came up with a book that was, I said, here's a golden chance to really try to come to grips with the Gloucester fishing, the methods, the history of it, what it's meant, the sacrifice, try to get into the inside of it, of fishing under the sail.
And when did you begin working?
This was 80, this must have been 80, this is around 81, I think.
So the book predates
9 years ago.
The ship going to Gloucester by many years.
Yeah. In any case, we worked all of this out, and Hal was very good about it, and we worked out, and Dave Godine published it, and we came up with a book that was my attempt, at least, to try to wrap up something about the Gloucester fishing as I see it, and it had been very heavily illustrated, in order to try to get the feel of what it was really like to be sailing in a schooner. I saw my friend Jim Sharp, who had the schooner Adventure and was taking her out of Maine, and I took a week's cruise with Jim as his guest, just to see how it felt to be on a deck of one of these vessels going at about 13 knots.
So you're doing something similar to what Morrison did.
Yeah, I was sort of researching this thing, you see. So that went into that book, and when the book came out and was published in '83, Sterling Hayden did the introduction for it. He was a great old sailor here. Sharp then wanted me to do a book about adventure. He'd been trying to put something together over the years. He'd had a lot of material, but he didn't really know how to put it together. So I took another cruise with Jim on adventure to research that one, and that book came out in '85, I think. And then we had another cruise to celebrate the publication of the book. But it was my association with, my close association with the schooner, and having written a book about it and being a good friend of Sharp, that got me involved with this whole business of trying to raise money for I mean, I was a real fish out of water in this whole business.
I wish we could go on in this. I just got a high sign that we have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
I have to say that was one of the fastest shows we've done. I enjoyed talking to you very much. We have our effort to lighten cable TV is to give a bottle of whiteout to all our guests. This is more symbolic than anything in the computer age. Not many people use whiteout anymore.
Does this help you in your my occasional blackouts?
It may. I don't know what happens if you drink it, but either way, it may help.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for being with us on the Writer's Block. I'd like to thank you too for being with us this evening. If you've learned something about writing and reading, history, journalism, then the show's been a success. I hope to see you next week as well. Thank you from the Writer's Block.